There are roads that exist only when you need them most, and Millfield Road was one of them. I've been driving hearses for Riverside Funeral Home for 12 years now. It's honest work, quiet, respectful, necessary. You develop routines in this business. Same routes, same timing, same careful attention to the families who trust you with their most precious cargo. I knew every street in our service area like the back of my hand. Every shortcut, every potential traffic bottleneck that could delay a procession. That's why it bothered me so much when my GPS started taking me down a road I'd never seen before. It started on a Tuesday in March. Mrs. Eleanor Henley, 83 years old, natural causes. Her service was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon at Riverside Cemetery, which meant I needed to have her loaded and ready for transport by 1:15. Standard procedure, I'd driven that route hundreds of times. Straight down Main Street, left on Oak Avenue, right on Cemetery Drive. 15 minutes, door to door. But when I started the engine that Tuesday, my GPS lit up with a different route entirely. Instead of the familiar path, it directed me to take Main Street to something called Millfield Road, then continue straight to the cemetery. I'd never heard of Millfield Road, and I'd been working these streets for over a decade. I figured it was a software glitch. GPS systems update all the time, adding new developments and road changes. Maybe the city had renamed a street or opened a new thoroughfare. I decided to follow it after all. The estimated arrival time was exactly the same as my usual route. Millfield Road turned out to be a narrow, tree-lined street that seemed to run parallel to Oak Avenue. The houses were older, maybe 1950s construction, with small front yards and chain-link fences. Nothing unusual about it, except for the fact that I was absolutely certain it hadn't existed the day before. The asphalt looked fresh, recently paved, and the street signs were pristine. No rust, no weathering. Mrs. Henley's service went off without a hitch. I delivered her to the cemetery right on schedule, and her family appreciated the professionalism. Just another successful transport in a career full of them. But that evening, when I was updating my route logs, I couldn't find Millfield Road on any map. Not on Google Maps, not on the funeral home's GPS system, not on the city planning website. It simply didn't exist in any database I could access. The following Tuesday brought another service. Mr. James Patterson, 77, heart attack. Same time slot, same destination. And once again, my GPS routed me down Millfield Road. This time, I paid closer attention. The street was exactly as I remembered it, quiet, well-maintained, lined with modest homes. A few residents were outside, tending their gardens or walking dogs. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly real. But when I tried to find the street again later that day, it was gone from every map and database I checked. Week after week, the pattern continued. Every Tuesday afternoon, transport to Riverside Cemetery. The GPS would direct me down Millfield Road. I began keeping detailed notes, street numbers, house descriptions, license plates of parked cars. I even took photos with my phone during one transport, though it felt disrespectful to do so with a deceased person in my care. The photos were always blurry, no matter how carefully I took them. Just enough detail to confirm that the street existed, but never clear enough to serve as real evidence. I started asking around. Other drivers, longtime residents, city workers. Nobody had ever heard of Millfield Road. The city records clerk, a woman who'd worked there for 30 years, looked at me like I was losing my mind when I asked about recent street additions in that area. "Son," she said, "there's been no new construction on that side of town since the 1980s. You sure you got the name right?" By the 5th Tuesday, I was questioning my own sanity. I considered taking a different route, ignoring the GPS entirely. But every time I tried to turn onto Oak Avenue instead, something would happen. Construction barriers that weren't there an hour before. A water main break. A fender bender that blocked the intersection. As if the universe itself was insisting I take Millfield Road. The street began to feel familiar. in a way that unsettled me. I recognized individual houses, remembered which ones had flowers in the front yard, which driveways had oil stains. It was becoming part of my regular route, etched into my memory, like any other street I'd driven 1,000 times. But Millfield Road only existed on Tuesdays, only during Mrs. Henley's time slot, only when I was carrying someone to their final rest. On the 8th Tuesday, I decided to test something. After completing Mrs. Henley's burial service, I drove back toward town, trying to retrace my steps. I found Main Street easily enough, but when I looked for the turn I'd taken just an hour earlier, there was nothing there. Just an unbroken line of businesses and parking lots, no side street in sight. I pulled over and called the funeral home's dispatcher, Maria, who'd been scheduling routes for 15 years. Maria, this might sound strange, but do we have any record of Millfield Road in our system? Millfield Road? Hold on, let me check. I could hear her typing. No, Tommy, nothing comes up. Why? My GPS keeps routing me down it for Tuesday transports. GPS systems glitch sometimes. You want me to send you manual directions next time? But I knew it wasn't a glitch. Whatever Millfield Road was, wherever it led, it was serving a purpose I didn't understand. Mrs. Henley always arrived at the cemetery on time. Her family was always satisfied with the service, and everything proceeded exactly as it should. The road appeared when it was needed, and vanished when it wasn't. Like so much in this business, it defied logical explanation, but served a deeper truth about death, memory, and the paths we take to reach our final destinations. I stopped questioning it after that. Every Tuesday, I follow my GPS down Millfield Road, past the familiar houses with their tended gardens and chain-link fences. I deliver my passengers safely to Riverside Cemetery, exactly on schedule. And every Tuesday evening, when I try to find that street again, it's gone existing only in my memory and in the route logs that somehow always show the correct arrival times, even for a road that doesn't exist. Some routes, I've learned, are meant to be traveled in faith rather than understanding. The rear-view camera was supposed to make our jobs easier, but sometimes technology shows you things you'd rather not see. I'm Rita Voss, and I've been a transport specialist with Memorial Services for 9 years. My job is straightforward: coordinate the movement of deceased individuals from funeral homes to cemeteries, ensuring that family members and funeral directors have safe, comfortable transportation during what's already the worst day of their lives. It's detailed work that requires patience, empathy, and absolute attention to protocol. Our fleet of transport vehicles was upgraded 2 years ago with rear-facing cameras, the kind you see in modern cars, to help with backing up and parking. For us, they serve a dual-purpose: safety monitoring and quality assurance. The cameras let me keep an eye on passengers without turning around, ensuring everyone's comfortable and secure during transport. I'd been using the system without incident until Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman's service in late September. Mrs. Kellerman was 91, a retired librarian who'd passed peacefully in her sleep. Her daughter, Patricia, had requested a simple graveside service at Oakwood Cemetery. The funeral director, Mr. Harrison from Whitmore Funeral Home, would accompany the body to provide ceremonial support and ensure everything proceeded according to the family's wishes. It was a routine transport. Overcast Thursday afternoon, light traffic, estimated travel time of 22 minutes. I loaded Mrs. Kellerman's casket according to protocol, secured all restraints, and helped Mr. Harrison into the passenger compartment. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s, someone I'd worked with dozens of times before. 5 minutes into the journey, I glanced at the rear-view camera display mounted on my dashboard. The screen showed the passenger compartment clearly, the secured casket, Mr. Harrison sitting respectfully in the forward-facing seat, his hands folded in his lap, and someone else. Sitting directly between Mr. Harrison and the casket was an elderly woman in a floral dress. She sat upright, perfectly still, staring straight ahead with pale, unfocused eyes. Her gray hair was neatly arranged, and her hands rested calmly on her purse. I blinked hard and looked again. The woman was still there, as clear as Mr. Harrison himself. My first instinct was that somehow we'd picked up an additional passenger by mistake, perhaps a family member who'd climbed in without my noticing. But I'd personally supervised the loading process. Only Mr. Harrison had entered the vehicle. I pressed the intercom button. "Mr. Harrison, is everything all right back there?" "Everything's fine, Rita. Thank you." "Are you alone back there?" "Yes, of course. Just me and Mrs. Kellerman." I looked at the camera display again. 3 figures. The casket, Mr. Harrison, and the woman in the floral dress. She hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. Her presence seemed completely natural, as if she belonged there. The logical part of my mind ran through explanations. Camera malfunction, maybe a double exposure effect from previous recordings, digital artifacts, compressed video files creating ghostly overlays. I'd heard of security cameras picking up strange images, reflections, shadows that looked like people. But this wasn't a shadow or a reflection. This was a fully formed person, sitting in 3-dimensional space, taking up physical room in the passenger compartment. I tried looking in my traditional rearview mirror, angling it to get a better view of the passenger area. From that perspective, I could see Mr. Harrison clearly, but no one else. Just him and the casket, exactly as expected. Back to the camera display. Still 3 occupants. The woman in the floral dress turned her head slightly, just enough to look directly into the camera lens. Her eyes seemed to focus on mine through the electronic connection. Not threatening, not angry, just aware. As if she knew I could see her and wanted me to understand that her presence was intentional. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I'd transported hundreds of bodies over the years, dealt with grieving families in various states of emotional distress, but I'd never experienced anything like this. The rational part of my mind insisted it was a technical glitch, but the rational part was losing ground rapidly. "Mr. Harrison," I said through the intercom, "did Mrs. Kellerman have any close friends or relatives who were particularly close to her?" "Oh, yes," he replied. "Her sister Dorothy May. They were inseparable their whole lives. Born just 11 months apart, lived together for the last 15 years after both their husbands passed. Dorothy May died about 6 months ago, same funeral home actually. Mrs. Kellerman never quite got over losing her." The woman in the floral dress smiled, not at the camera, but at something to her left, toward where Mr. Harrison was sitting. "She used to say," Mr. Harrison continued, "that Dorothy May would never let her make this final trip alone. Said they'd promised each other that." I glanced at the camera display. The woman's mouth was moving silently, as if she was speaking to someone. Mr. Harrison was nodding slightly, though when I looked at him through the regular mirror, he appeared to be sitting quietly with his eyes closed. The rest of the journey passed in surreal calm. I monitored the camera obsessively, watching the woman who couldn't possibly be there. She remained perfectly still most of the time, occasionally turning to look at Mr. Harrison, or reaching out as if to touch the casket. Her movements were gentle, protective, familiar. When we arrived at Oakwood Cemetery, I parked and immediately went to open the passenger compartment. Mr. Harrison emerged alone, just as he'd entered. I looked inside one casket, one empty seat, no trace of any additional passenger. "Thank you, Rita," Mr. Harrison said. "That was a very peaceful ride. Mrs. Kellerman would have appreciated it." As we prepared for the graveside service, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by the dozen or so family members who'd gathered, but by someone standing just outside the group. Someone in a floral dress, who'd come to see her sister safely to rest. After the service, as I was securing the empty passenger compartment, Mr. Harrison approached me. "Rita, I hope this doesn't sound strange, but during the ride, I could have sworn I felt Dorothy May with us." "Mrs. Kellerman always said her sister would find a way to be there when the time came. I looked at him carefully. What made you think that? He smiled, a mix of sadness and comfort in his expression. She always did hate being alone. I've reviewed the camera footage dozens of times since that day. Every time I watch it, the woman in the floral dress is there, clear as life, sharing the final journey with her sister. But when I show the recording to colleagues, all they see is Mr. Harrison sitting by himself in an otherwise empty passenger compartment. The camera still works perfectly for routine transports. It's only on certain occasions, usually involving people who died shortly after losing someone close to them, that it reveals additional passengers, people who, according to every logical standard, shouldn't be there. I've learned not to mention it to most families or funeral directors, but sometimes, when I sense they might understand, I'll quietly let them know that their loved one didn't make the journey alone. Most of them aren't surprised. They nod and smile, as if they'd expected nothing less. The technology shows me what's really there, even when my eyes can't see it. And what's really there, more often than not, is love that death can't separate, traveling together one last time, making sure no one has to face eternity alone. A hearse handles differently when it carries the dead, but it shouldn't handle like someone living has climbed aboard. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been operating funeral vehicles for Eternal Rest Mortuary for 14 years. It's specialized work that requires more than just a commercial driver's license. You need to understand vehicle balance, weight distribution, and the unique handling characteristics of a hearse when it's loaded versus empty. A casket and its occupant can add anywhere from 300 to 800 pounds to the rear of the vehicle, changing everything about how it brakes, turns, and accelerates. You develop an intuitive sense for these things over time. Every hearse has its own personality, its own quirks in how it responds to cargo. I could tell you within 50 pounds how much weight I was carrying, just by the way the vehicle settled on its suspension, how it leaned into turns, how the steering wheel felt in my hands. That's why what happened during Mrs. Catherine Wynn's transport bothered me so much. The vehicle behaved like it was carrying weight that wasn't there. Mrs. Nguyen was 78, a retired seamstress who'd passed after a brief illness. Her service was scheduled for 11 in the morning at Greenwood Cemetery, about a 20-minute drive through residential neighborhoods and past the old industrial district. Standard cargo load, Mrs. Nguyen had been a small woman, maybe 110 pounds, in a medium-weight casket. Total additional weight probably around 450 pounds, well within normal parameters. I loaded her according to protocol, secured all restraints, and performed my standard pre-transport inspection. Everything checked out perfectly. The hearse was running smoothly, tire pressure was good, suspension felt normal when I settled into the driver's seat. But about 5 minutes into the journey, something changed. The vehicle started pulling hard to the right, as if someone had suddenly climbed into the passenger seat. Not a gradual drift, a definitive tug that required constant correction to maintain a straight line. The steering wheel vibrated under my hands, and I could feel the right front corner of the car settling lower on its suspension. My first thought was tire trouble, blowout, sudden loss of pressure, maybe road debris that had damaged the sidewall. I pulled over at the first safe opportunity, a gas station parking lot, and got out to inspect. All 4 tires were perfect. No damage, no deflation, tread and sidewalls intact. I checked the suspension components I could see. No broken springs, no obvious mechanical failure. I even popped the hood and looked at the engine mounts, thinking maybe something had shifted under there. Everything looked exactly as it should. I got back in and continued toward the cemetery. The pulling sensation returned immediately, stronger than before. It felt like someone weighing about 200 pounds had climbed into the passenger seat and was leaning against the right side of the car. The sensation was so pronounced that I found myself glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see someone sitting there. The seat was empty, of course, but the feeling persisted, that unmistakable sense of additional weight, additional presence. I tried adjusting my driving to compensate. Lighter grip on the steering wheel, slower turns, more gradual acceleration and braking. Nothing helped. The hearse continued to handle like it was carrying more weight than I'd loaded, distributed in places where no weight should be. About halfway to the cemetery, I pulled over again. This was becoming dangerous if the vehicle was experiencing some kind of mechanical failure. I couldn't risk continuing with Mrs. Nguyen in my care. I called the mortuary's dispatch and explained the situation. Marcus, you want us to send another hearse? Sarah, our dispatcher, had been handling logistics for 20 years. She took vehicle problems seriously. I don't know what to send, Sarah. There's nothing wrong with the car that I can identify. It just feels like I'm carrying more weight than I should be. More weight how? Load shifted? I walked around to the back and checked the cargo restraints. Mrs. Nguyen's casket was exactly where it should be, secured exactly as I'd left it. No shifting, no movement, no change in position. No, the load's fine. It's like someone got in the passenger compartment. You check the passenger compartment? I had to pause at that. I'd checked the external mechanics, verified the cargo, inspected the engine, but I hadn't actually looked inside the passenger area of the hearse, the section where family members sometimes rode during processions. I opened the rear door and peered inside. Empty seats, exactly as expected. But the weight sensation was stronger here, more concentrated. The air felt heavier, like someone was occupying space without being visible. Sarah, I'm going to continue to the cemetery. Whatever this is, it's not dangerous, just unusual. You sure, Marcus? We can't have anything go wrong during transport. I was sure, though I couldn't explain why. The vehicle was handling strangely, but predictably, I could compensate for the pulling, account for the weight distribution. It felt like driving with a passenger who happened to be invisible. The rest of the journey to Greenwood Cemetery was uneventful in terms of actual driving, but the sensation of carrying additional weight never diminished. If anything, it became more pronounced. By the time I reached the cemetery gates, it felt like several people had joined the journey, not just one passenger, but multiple presences sharing the ride. Here's the strange part. The moment I passed through the cemetery entrance, everything returned to normal. The pulling stopped, the weight sensation disappeared, and the hearse handled exactly as it should for its actual cargo load. Like whatever had been riding with us had reached its destination and no longer needed transportation. Mrs. Nguyen's graveside service proceeded without incident. Her family appreciated the respectful handling of her transport, and everything concluded exactly as planned. But as I was securing the empty hearse for the return trip, Mrs. Nguyen's eldest son approached me. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "This might sound odd, but did you notice anything unusual during the drive here?" I studied his face carefully. "What kind of unusual?" "My mother. She never liked traveling alone. Never. After my father died 3 years ago, she wouldn't even go to the grocery store by herself. She'd call one of us kids, or ask a neighbor, or just wait until someone could go with her." He paused, looking back toward the gravesite. "I was just wondering if she'd found some company for this last trip." I thought about the weight shifts, the sensation of invisible passengers, the way the hearse had felt crowded with presences I couldn't see. "She wasn't alone," I told him simply. He nodded, unsurprised. "That's what I thought. Thank you. I've driven hundreds of transports since then, and most proceed exactly as expected. But occasionally, maybe once every few months, I'll feel that familiar sensation of invisible weight, of passengers who need a ride to their final destination. It always stops at the cemetery gates, as if whoever was traveling with me has reached exactly where they needed to be. I don't question it anymore. In this business, you learn that death doesn't always mean traveling alone. Sometimes it just means your companions aren't visible to everyone else. The hearse carries who it needs to carry, weighs what it needs to weigh. My job is simply to drive safely and get everyone seen and unseen to where they're going. Some appointments are made decades before anyone realizes they're needed. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I've been driving for Meadowbrook Funeral Services for 7 years now. It's methodical. Work pickups, deliveries, transport coordination between funeral homes and cemeteries. Every trip gets documented. Time, date, destination, cargo details. I keep careful records because families depend on precision during the most difficult moments of their lives. I maintain my hearse like a professional should. Clean interior, organized glove compartment, everything in its place. That's why the appointment card bothered me so much it appeared in my sun visor without explanation, and it wasn't mine. It was a Tuesday in October when I first found it. I was preparing for a morning transport, adjusting my mirrors and checking my route, when I flipped down the visor and a yellowed piece of cardstock fell into my lap. The card was roughly 3 inches by 2 inches, printed on thick paper stock that had aged to a cream color. In faded blue ink, someone had written, J. Morrison, 3:30 p.m., Lot 47. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and J. Morrison wasn't on my schedule for that day. In fact, I'd never transported anyone by that name in my 7 years with Meadowbrook. I checked my logbooks, searched the company database, even called our records department. No J. Morrison in our system. Lot 47 was equally puzzling. Meadowbrook services 3 primary cemeteries, and I knew their layout systems well. Oakwood used numbered plots within lettered sections. Riverside used a grid system with street names. Sunset Memorial used family names for their lots. None of them had a Lot 47 that I could identify. I assumed someone had left the card in my hearse by mistake, maybe a previous driver or a funeral director who'd used the vehicle. Old appointment cards sometimes turn up in strange places. I tucked it into my logbook and forgot about it, but the card reappeared the next morning, wedged into the same spot in my sun visor. This time, I examined it more carefully. The paper was definitely old, maybe 20 or 30 years, based on the aging and the printing style. The ink had faded, but the writing was still clear enough to read. J. Morrison, 3:30 p.m., Lot 47. No date, no additional information. I showed it to Maria, our dispatcher, who'd been with the company for 15 years. You recognize this handwriting, Maria. She studied the card, turning it over, holding it up to the light. Looks familiar, but I can't place it. Could be from before my time. You want me to ask Mr. Meadowbrook? Samuel Meadowbrook was the owner's son, 3rd generation to run the funeral home. If anyone would recognize an old appointment card, it would be him. But when Maria showed it to him later that day, he was just as puzzled as we were. Doesn't ring any bells, he said. Could be from Dad's era, or even Grandpa's. We used to write everything by hand back then, before computers. But I can't think of any Morrison families we've served recently. The card kept returning. Every few days, I'd find it in my sun visor, always in exactly the same position. I started throwing it away, but it would reappear within a day or two. I tried taking it home, locking it in my desk drawer, but the next morning it would be back in the hearse. After 2 weeks of this, I decided to treat it like a legitimate appointment. On a Thursday afternoon when I had no scheduled transports, I drove to all 3 cemeteries we serviced, looking for anything that might correspond to Lot 47. I spent hours walking through sections, checking plot markers, talking to groundskeepers. At Sunset Memorial, I found something interesting. In the oldest section of the cemetery, there was a row of plots that had been renumbered sometime in the past. The current markers showed the Hartley family plots, numbers 43 through 49. But if you looked carefully at the stone foundations, you could see where older numbers had been chiseled away and replaced. The groundskeeper, an elderly man named Pete, who'd worked there for 30 years, confirmed my suspicion. Oh yeah, that whole section got renumbered back in the 80s. Used to be lot numbers instead of family names. Lot 47 would be right about here. He pointed to a well-maintained gravesite with a modest headstone reading, Morrison Family Plot. Morrison? I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you know about the Morrisons? Old family. Been buried here since the cemetery opened. Last one was Pete. Consulted a small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. Jessica Morrison. Died in 1991. No surviving family that we know of. Plot's been empty since then. Jessica Morrison. J. Morrison. That afternoon at exactly 3:30, I was standing beside Lot 47 when a small procession arrived. Two vehicles, a hearse from a funeral home I didn't recognize, and a sedan with an elderly woman in the passenger seat. The hearse was carrying someone for burial in the Morrison plot. I approached the funeral director, a man I'd never met before. "Excuse me, I'm Elena from Meadowbrook. Are you burying someone named J. Morrison today?" He looked surprised. "Yes, James Morrison. How did you know?" This was a very private service, no public notice. Just one family member. James Morrison? Jessica's nephew. He's been taking care of the family plot for 30 years, ever since she died. Never married, no children. When he passed last week, he left instructions to be buried next to his Aunt Jessica. Said she'd been waiting for family to join her. The elderly woman from the sedan was James Morrison's landlady, the only person who'd known him well enough to arrange his funeral. She'd found specific instructions in his apartment, not just burial preferences, but a detailed request that his service be held at exactly 3:30 in the afternoon at Lot 47. He was very particular about the time, she told me. Said he had an appointment to keep. I watched James Morrison's quiet burial from a respectful distance. When it was finished, I returned to my hearse and checked the sun visor. The appointment card was gone. But it wasn't the end of the story. Over the following months, other appointment cards began appearing in my visor. Different handwriting, different names, different times and locations. Always for people I'd never heard of. Scheduled for services I wasn't handling. And yet, when I followed the cards, there was always something: a burial, a memorial service, a family gathering at a gravesite. People fulfilling appointments that had been made years or even decades earlier by relatives who'd known somehow that specific times and places would become important. I keep a special logbook now for these mysterious appointments. I treat them with the same respect I'd give any official scheduling, because I've learned that some commitments transcend the normal boundaries of time and planning. The dead, it seems, are very good at keeping their appointments, even when they have to make the arrangements themselves, years in advance, through handwritten cards that appear exactly when and where they're needed. I've stopped questioning the system. I just show up at the specified times and locations, ready to witness whatever reunion or farewell has been decades in the making. Some appointments are too important to trust to the living. Sometimes the dead have to make their own arrangements. The radio in a hearse is supposed to carry music for the living, not eulogies for the dead. I'm Bill Nash, and I've been a transport driver for Highland Funeral Home for 11 years. It's solitary work most of the time, just me, the vehicle, and the deceased making their final journey to whatever cemetery their families have chosen. I keep the radio low during transports, usually tuned to classical music or soft instrumental pieces. Nothing that would seem disrespectful to the families who might occasionally ride along. The radio in my regular hearse, unit number 4, was a standard factory model, AM divided by FM, CD player, nothing fancy. It had worked perfectly for 3 years without any technical problems. Clear reception, good sound quality. All the local stations came in strong and steady, until I started driving past mile marker 23 on Highway 6. It happened first during a Thursday morning transport in late August. I was carrying Mrs. Ruth Connors to her burial at Pine Valley Cemetery. About a 30-minute drive that took me through farmland and past the old state highway markers. Mile marker 23 sits at the crest of a small hill, right where the road curves past an abandoned gas station that's been closed since the 1990s. As I approached the marker, my radio cut to static. Not unusual. Rural areas sometimes have dead zones where signals get weak, but instead of silence or white noise, the static gradually resolved into voices multiple voices, singing. It was a hymn I recognized. Amazing Grace. Full congregation, maybe 30 or 40 people singing in harmony. Crystal clear audio quality, like I was sitting in the middle of a church service. I glanced at the radio display. Still showed the classical station I'd been listening to, still at the same volume level. But instead of string quartets, I was hearing a funeral service in progress. The singing ended, and the minister's voice began delivering a eulogy. We gather today to celebrate the life of William Nash, husband, father, devoted member of this community. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. William Nash. That's my full name. The eulogy continued, describing details that were unmistakably about me. My job at Highland Funeral Home, my wife Sarah, our 2 children, even specific hobbies and characteristics that only someone who knew me well could know. The minister spoke about my dedication to helping families during their most difficult times, my quiet strength, my love for old movies and weekend fishing trips. But I was alive, driving down Highway 6, listening to my own funeral service. The static lasted until I passed mile marker 23, then cut back to classical music as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Connor's service proceeded normally, and I didn't mention the radio incident to anyone. I figured it was some kind of interference, maybe picking up a distant station that happened to be broadcasting a service for someone with the same name. Except it happened again the following week. Same location, same pattern. Radio cuts to static as I approach mile marker 23, resolves into a funeral service, then returns to normal programming once I pass the marker. This time it was a different deceased person's service, but during the prayers, I heard my name again, people asking for blessings on William Nash, talking about how much I'd meant to them. By the third occurrence, I was deliberately timing my routes to avoid mile marker 23. I'd take alternate roads, add extra travel time, anything to avoid triggering whatever was happening with my radio. But sometimes the scheduling didn't allow for detours, and I'd find myself approaching that hill with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. The funeral services were always different, but certain elements remained constant. They were always well attended, always included people who seemed to know intimate details about my life, always spoke about me in the past tense as if I'd died and been buried. What disturbed me most was how accurate the details were. The radio eulogies mentioned things I'd never told anyone, childhood memories, private thoughts, fears, and hopes I kept to myself. During one broadcast, I heard Sarah's voice delivering what sounded like a widow's remembrance, describing conversations we'd had just the night before. I started keeping a small recording device in the glove compartment, hoping to capture evidence of these transmissions. But every time I tried to record the static broadcasts, the device would malfunction, dead batteries, corrupted files, mechanical failures that never happened any other time. After 2 months of this, I decided to investigate mile marker 23 itself. I drove out there on my day off, parked near the abandoned gas station, and walked around the area. Nothing seemed unusual, just an old highway marker, some overgrown weeds, and the crumbling remains of a business that had closed decades ago. But when I asked around town about the location, I learned something interesting. The abandoned gas station had been the site of multiple fatal accidents over the years. Something about the curve, the hill, the way visibility dropped off right at that spot. According to the county records clerk, at least 7 people had died in crashes near mile marker 23 since the highway was built. None of them were named William Nash, but all of them had been local residents, people who'd been laid to rest in the cemeteries I serviced. I started paying closer attention to the funeral services I heard on the radio. The deceased were always people I'd transported at some point in my career, Mrs. Patterson, who died in a house fire 3 years ago. Young Tommy Rodriguez, who'd been killed in a motorcycle accident. Elderly Mr. Chen, who'd passed from cancer just last month. People whose final journeys I'd been part of, whose families I'd helped during their worst moments. The realization hit me gradually. The radio wasn't broadcasting random funeral services. It was broadcasting services for people I'd cared about. People whose stories had stayed with me long after I'd delivered them to their final rest. And somehow, in these broadcast eulogies, I was being remembered alongside them. During one particularly clear transmission, I heard a voice I recognized, Mrs. Patterson's daughter, Linda, who'd ridden with me during her mother's transport. "Bill Nash was there when we needed him most," she said. "He treated Mom with such dignity, such respect. It meant everything to our family. I hope someone takes care of Bill the same way when his time comes." The broadcasts weren't random interference. They were thank you notes from the dead. Acknowledgements from people who'd appreciated my care during their transition from life to burial. Somehow, near mile marker 23, the boundary between the living and the dead became thin enough for gratitude to travel backward through time. I stopped avoiding the location after that. When my routes took me past mile marker 23, I'd listen carefully to whatever service was being broadcast. Sometimes I recognized voices. Sometimes I didn't. But they were always speaking about me with affection, with appreciation, with the kind of warmth that made 11 years of transport work feel meaningful. The strangest broadcast came on a cold December morning. As I approached mile marker 23, the radio filled with the sound of children singing Christmas carols. Young voices, maybe 8 or 10 years old, performing Silent Night with the slightly off-key charm of a school pageant. When the song ended, a child's voice spoke directly into the radio. "Thank you, Mr. Bill, for bringing Grandpa to his new home. Mommy says angels help people get to heaven, and you're our angel." I pulled over after that transmission, sat in the hearse for 20 minutes, and cried harder than I had since my father's funeral. The radio still cuts to static at mile marker 23. Still broadcasts funeral services for people I've transported. Still carries voices of gratitude from families I've helped. I've learned to think of it as a form of occupational blessing. Confirmation that the work I do matters. That dignity in death creates ripples of appreciation that somehow find their way back to the living. My wife Sarah knows about the broadcasts now. I finally told her after hearing her voice during one of the services, expressing love and gratitude for a husband who was still alive to receive it. "It doesn't scare you?" she asked. "No," I said. "It reassures me. When my real funeral comes someday, I'll know that the people I've helped will be there in spirit, returning the kindness I tried to show them." The radio continues to work perfectly, except for that one stretch of highway, that one hill where the living and the dead exchange messages of thanks and remembrance. I look forward to those brief transmissions now, grateful for the reminder that this work transporting people to their final rest is sacred work that creates connections beyond death. Someday, I'll be the one being transported past mile marker 23. And maybe, if I've done my job well, someone else's radio will carry my voice back to the world of the living, adding my thanks to the chorus of gratitude that travels through static and time. Sometimes the dead keep their own appointments, even when their houses burned down 60 years ago. I'm Sarah Kim, and I've been driving for Westside Memorial Services for 8 years. It's demanding work that requires flexibility, emergency pickups, schedule changes, last-minute requests from families who are dealing with loss while trying to coordinate complex logistics. Our dispatch system tracks everything: pickup addresses, delivery times, family contacts, special instructions. I'm used to unusual requests, but I'd never received calls for the same pickup address 3 times in 3 weeks, especially when that address didn't exist. It started on a Monday morning in March. I was finishing breakfast when my phone rang with a transport request. "Sarah, we need you to pick up Mrs. Helen Chen from 1522 Maple Street for a 2 o'clock service at Riverside Cemetery," dispatch told me. Standard protocol: name, address, destination, timing. I drove to 1522 Maple Street and found an empty lot. Not an empty house, an empty lot. Overgrown grass, a few scattered bricks, the concrete foundation outline of where a building had once stood. No house, no Mrs. Chen. No indication that anyone had lived there recently. I called dispatch. Maria, I'm at 1522 Maple Street, but there's no house here. You sure you got the address right? Let me double check. I could hear her typing. That's what the family gave us. 1522 Maple Street. They said Mrs. Chen would be ready for pickup at 1:30. There's literally no house here, Maria. Just an empty lot. That's weird. Let me call the family back and get clarification. But when Maria tried to call the number the family had provided, it was disconnected. The contact information led nowhere. And there was no record of anyone named Chen in our current client database. I spent an hour at that empty lot, waiting for someone to show up, for a phone call with corrected information, for any explanation of the mix-up. Nothing. Eventually, dispatch told me to return to the funeral home. Sorry about the confusion, Sarah. Must have been a miscommunication somewhere. Except the same thing happened the following Monday. Same phone call, same address, same Mrs. Helen Chen, scheduled for pickup at 1:30 for a 2 o'clock service. This time, I didn't waste time driving to the empty lot. I asked dispatch to verify the information before I left. Maria, you're sure about this address? 1522 Maple Street? That's what I have, Sarah. Family called this morning, very specific about the timing. What family? What's their contact information? Maria paused. That's strange. I don't have their phone number in the system. I could have sworn they gave me contact details. I drove to Maple Street anyway, hoping to find some explanation. The empty lot looked exactly the same, overgrown, abandoned, no signs of recent activity. But as I sat in my hearse, engine running, I noticed something I'd missed the previous week. There was a casket-sized impression in the tall grass, like someone had laid something heavy there and left it for several hours. The grass was pressed down in a perfect rectangle, with what looked like wheel tracks leading from the street to the spot. I got out and examined the area more carefully. The grass wasn't just pressed down, it was yellowed and dying, as if something had been resting there for weeks. But that was impossible. I'd been here just 7 days earlier, and the lot had been uniformly overgrown. When I returned to the funeral home, I asked our records manager to search for any previous services involving a Helen Chen. She found one entry, dated 1962. Helen Chen, age 73. Services held at Riverside Cemetery. Died in a house fire on Maple Street. She looked up from her computer screen. That's interesting. The address listed is 1522 Maple Street. What happened to the house? Looks like it burned down the same night Mrs. Chen died. She was the only fatality, but the structure was a total loss. The third Monday, I was ready. I arrived at 1522 Maple Street early, planning to wait and see what happened. If someone was playing an elaborate prank, I wanted to catch them in the act. If there was some rational explanation for these mysterious pickup requests, I was determined to find it. At exactly 1:30, I heard a car door slam. I looked around but saw no other vehicles on the street. Just me, my hearse, and the empty lot. But the sound had been unmistakable. The distinctive thunk of a heavy car door, closing, maybe 50 feet away. Then I heard footsteps on gravel. There was no gravel anywhere near the empty lot. The sidewalk was concrete. The lot was grass and dirt. But I could clearly hear someone walking on gravel, moving from the area where a front door might have been toward the street. The footsteps stopped right beside my hearse. I looked in my mirrors, checked my blind spots, even got out and walked around the vehicle. Nobody there. But when I opened the rear compartment to check my equipment, I found something that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. A single white rose, placed carefully on the gurney where a casket would normally rest. The rose was fresh, recently cut, with a small card attached. In elderly handwriting, someone had written, "Thank you for coming. I've been waiting." I drove to Riverside Cemetery with that rose, unsure what else to do. As I pulled through the cemetery gates, I noticed an unusual amount of activity in the older section. Groundskeepers, a small group of people in dark clothing, what looked like a graveside service in progress. Curious, I parked and walked over. A minister was concluding remarks for someone named Helen Chen. The mourners were elderly, maybe 6 or 7 people who looked like they'd known each other for decades. After the service, I approached the minister. "Excuse me, I'm Sarah from Westside Memorial. Was this service for Helen Chen?" "Yes, though it's been a long time coming. Helen died 60 years ago, but her family never felt like they'd properly laid her to rest. Today would have been her 133rd birthday, so they decided to hold a memorial service at her grave." Her 133rd birthday? Born in 1890, died in 1962. Tragic fire on Maple Street. She lived alone, no immediate family. These folks are descendants of her neighbors, people who felt they should have done more for her back then. One of the mourners, an elderly woman named Dorothy, overheard our conversation. "Helen was a lovely person," she said. "Always helped others, never asked for anything in return. When she died in that fire, it happened so fast that they never found all her belongings. People always felt like she deserved better, like she was still waiting for someone to properly see her home." I showed Dorothy the white rose and card. She smiled and nodded. "That sounds like Helen. She was always grateful, always polite. Even in the worst circumstances, she'd find a way to say thank you." I never received another pickup call for 1522 Maple Street. But every year, on what would have been Helen Chen's birthday, I drive by that empty lot. And every year, there's a single white rose lying in the grass where her house used to stand. I've learned that some pickup requests come from beyond normal scheduling systems. Sometimes the dead arrange their own transportation, making appointments decades in advance, trusting that eventually someone will show up to take them home. The empty lot on Maple Street is still empty, still overgrown, but it's not abandoned anymore. It's a pickup location for someone who waited 60 years for a ride to her final rest, who finally found a way to complete a journey that had been interrupted by tragedy. I keep Helen Chen's card in my logbook now, a reminder that some calls come from clients who've been waiting longer than we realize, who trust us to show up even when the address leads to places that only exist in memory and gratitude. Death has its own temperature, and some of the dead are colder than others. My name is Frank Rodriguez, and I've been a hearse driver for Peaceful Valley Funeral Home for 13 years. It's careful work that requires attention to environmental controls, maintaining proper temperature for the deceased, ensuring comfort for family members who sometimes ride along, keeping the vehicle's climate system running efficiently in all weather conditions. Every hearse has a sophisticated HVAC system designed to maintain consistent temperature throughout the passenger and cargo areas. Digital displays show exact readings, automatic controls adjust for external conditions, and backup systems ensure reliability even during extreme weather. I monitor these systems constantly because temperature fluctuations can be disrespectful to both the deceased and their families. That's why what started happening in July was so disturbing. The temperature gauge would drop 20 degrees during certain transports, and no amount of technical troubleshooting could explain why. It began with Mr. Earl Davidson, 78 years old, found dead in his apartment after neighbors complained about the smell. He'd been alone for at least 2 weeks before anyone discovered the body. Not an unusual situation. Sadly, elderly people sometimes pass away, with no immediate family to check on them, no daily routines that would alert others to their absence. I loaded Mr. Davidson on a Tuesday morning for transport to Sunset Memorial. Standard procedures, normal cargo weight, everything secured according to protocol. The July heat was already pushing 90 degrees, and I had the air conditioning running at moderate levels to maintain a comfortable 72 degrees inside the vehicle. 5 minutes into the transport, the temperature reading dropped to 52 degrees. Not a gradual decline, a sudden, dramatic drop that made my breath visible in the July heat. Ice crystals began forming on the inside of the windows, and I could feel the cold air settling around my shoulders like a heavy blanket. I checked the HVAC controls. Everything was set exactly as it should be, but the system was working overtime, trying to heat air that was somehow being cooled by an unknown source. The compressor was running constantly, struggling against something that was pulling heat out of the vehicle faster than the heating system could replace it. I pulled over and performed a full system check. Thermostat readings, electrical connections, refrigerant levels, airflow sensors, everything tested normal. The HVAC system was functioning perfectly, but the interior temperature remained 20 degrees below what the controls indicated it should be. The cold intensified as we got closer to the cemetery. By the time I reached Sunset Memorial, frost was forming on the metal surfaces inside the hearse, and my hands were shaking from the chill. But the moment I parked and turned off the engine, the temperature returned to normal. The ice crystals melted, the frost disappeared, and the air warmed back to the expected July heat. Mr. Davidson's burial proceeded without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory of that bone-deep cold, the way it had seemed to emanate from the cargo area and spread throughout the vehicle. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Mrs. Betty Flores, 81, discovered dead in her bedroom after missing her weekly phone call with her sister. She'd been alone for 10 days, maybe longer. The same pattern, normal loading, normal initial conditions, then a sudden temperature drop that defied every law of thermodynamics I understood. This time I was prepared with a backup thermometer. The official gauge read 50 degrees, but my handheld device showed the same thing. The cold was real, measurable, and completely unexplained. I started keeping detailed logs of every transport, noting temperature anomalies alongside client information. Over the following months, a pattern emerged. The temperature drops only happened when I was transporting people who had died alone, who had been undiscovered for extended periods, who had spent their final days or weeks in isolation. The longer they'd been alone before death, the colder the transport became. Mr. James Wright, found after 3 weeks, brought the interior temperature down to 45 degrees. Mrs. Dorothy Nash, alone for a month before her landlord discovered her, created conditions so cold that the windows completely frosted over, and I had to drive by GPS because visibility was zero. But it wasn't just about isolation before death. The cold seemed to reflect a deeper kind of loneliness. People who had lived their final years without meaningful human connection, who had died without anyone to mourn their passing, who faced the transition from life to burial without the comfort of loving relationships. The coldest transport I ever experienced was Mr. Robert Kim, a retired accountant who had outlived his wife, his siblings, and most of his friends. He'd been dead for 2 months before city workers found him during a wellness check. The temperature in my hearse dropped to 38 degrees during that transport, cold enough that I could see my breath, cold enough that my fingers went numb on the steering wheel. But here's what I learned about the cold. It wasn't malevolent. It wasn't angry or vengeful. It was just lonely, profoundly, achingly lonely. It felt like the physical manifestation of years spent without warmth, without human touch, without the simple comfort of knowing that someone cared whether you lived or died. During Mr. Kim's transport, I found myself talking to him, not preaching or praying, just talking, telling him about my day, describing the route we were taking, mentioning the weather outside. Simple human conversation, the kind he probably hadn't heard in months before his death. The temperature began to rise as I talked, not dramatically, but noticeably, as if the sound of a human voice, even one-sided conversation, was providing a kind of warmth that the HVAC system couldn't supply. I started doing that routinely for the cold transports, talking to the deceased, sharing observations about the world outside, sometimes reading news articles or sports scores aloud. It seemed to help. The temperature would still drop, but not as severely, and it would stabilize rather than continuing to plummet. Other drivers started reporting similar experiences. Temperature anomalies during transports of people who had died in isolation. We compared notes, shared techniques for managing the cold, developed unofficial protocols for dealing with what we came to call loneliness syndrome. The funeral home never acknowledged these reports officially. Temperature fluctuations could be explained by mechanical issues, atmospheric pressure changes, or equipment malfunctions. But everyone who drove transports knew the truth. Some deaths carry their own climate, and that climate reflects the emotional conditions surrounding the final days of life. I've driven hundreds of transports since that first experience with Mr. Davidson. Most proceed at normal temperature, reflecting lives that ended surrounded by love, care, and human connection. But occasionally, I'll feel that familiar chill, that bone-deep cold that speaks of isolation and abandonment. When that happens, I turn up the heat, start talking, and do my best to provide the human warmth that was missing from someone's final chapter. It's a small gesture, maybe meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but I like to think it makes the journey a little easier for people who spent too much time traveling alone. The dead may be beyond physical comfort, but they still respond to kindness. And sometimes, kindness is just the sound of another human voice, cutting through the cold, letting them know that someone cares enough to notice their passing, to speak their name one more time, to ensure they don't make their final journey in the same silence that marked their final days among the living. Mirrors in a hearse serve a practical purpose, but sometimes they reflect more than the road behind you. I'm Joyce Liu, and I've been a transport operator for Harborview Funeral Services for 6 years. My job involves careful coordination of vehicle movements, ensuring clear sight lines during transport, and maintaining awareness of everything happening around the hearse during our most sensitive journeys. Proper mirror adjustment is crucial. You need to see following vehicles, monitor the cargo area, and watch for any signs of distress from family members who might be riding along. I'm meticulous about my mirror positioning. Driver's side mirror, angled to show the left rear quarter panel, passenger mirror covering the right side blind spot, center rear view mirror providing full visibility into the passenger compartment. I check them before every transport, adjust them if anything seems off, clean them weekly to ensure crystal clear reflection. That's why the woman in the blue dress troubled me so much. She appeared in my side mirror every evening for 3 weeks, always in the same position, always wearing the same clothes, always staring straight ahead with an expression of infinite patience. It started during a Thursday evening transport in October. Mrs. Agnes Walsh, 85 years old, died peacefully at home, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her service was scheduled for the following morning, but the family had requested evening transport to allow time for out-of-town relatives to arrive for viewing. Standard procedure for families who needed extra time to gather. I loaded Mrs. Walsh at 7:30 in the evening as the sun was setting. Beautiful autumn weather, clear roads, estimated travel time of 15 minutes to Hillside Cemetery. I'd made this exact transport dozens of times before, knew every turn and traffic light along the route. About 5 minutes into the journey, I glanced at my driver's side mirror to check for following traffic. Instead of just the empty road behind me, I saw a woman sitting in the passenger compartment. She was elderly, maybe 70 or 75, wearing a navy blue dress with small white buttons. Her gray hair was neatly arranged, and she held a small black purse in her lap. She sat perfectly still, looking straight ahead, not acknowledging my presence or showing any awareness that she was in a moving vehicle. My first thought was that I'd missed loading an additional passenger, maybe a family member who had climbed in while I was securing the casket, but I distinctly remembered checking the passenger compartment before departure. Mrs. Walsh's transport was unaccompanied. No family members had requested to ride along. I pressed the intercom button to communicate with the passenger area. "Excuse me, ma'am, I didn't realize you were riding with us today. Are you a member of Mrs. Walsh's family?" No response. The woman continued staring straight ahead, motionless. I tried again. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Is everything all right back there? Still nothing. But when I looked in the mirror again, she was still there, clearly visible, solid, and three-dimensional as any living person. At the next traffic light, I turned around to look directly into the passenger compartment. Mrs. Walsh's casket was positioned exactly as I'd left it, secured and dignified. The seats were empty. No elderly woman in a blue dress, no additional passenger of any kind. But when I glanced back at the side mirror, she was there. Same position, same clothes, same serene expression. The rest of the transport to Hillside Cemetery proceeded normally, except for the woman who existed only in my mirror. She never moved, never spoke, never acknowledged my attempts to communicate. Just sat quietly, as if she was exactly where she belonged. When I arrived at the cemetery and opened the passenger compartment for unloading, there was no trace of any additional passenger, just Mrs. Walsh and the normal equipment for her transfer to the viewing facility. I convinced myself it had been an optical illusion, reflection of car headlights, maybe shadows from passing street lamps, creating the appearance of a person. Mirrors can play tricks on you, especially during evening hours when lighting conditions are constantly changing. But she appeared again the following Thursday. Different deceased person, different family, same evening time slot. This time, I was transporting Mr. Harold Chen to St. Mary's Cemetery, but the woman in the blue dress was back in my side mirror. Same position, same clothes, same patient expression. I decided to test what I was seeing. At a safe stretch of road, I adjusted my mirror to different angles, trying to change the reflection or eliminate whatever optical illusion was creating this apparition. No matter how I positioned the mirror, if it showed the passenger compartment, it showed the woman. But when I angled the mirror to show only the road behind me, she disappeared. Only when the mirror reflected the interior of the hearse did she become visible. Over the following weeks, the pattern became established. Every Thursday evening transport, regardless of who I was carrying or where I was going, the woman would appear in my side mirror. Always the same woman, always in the blue dress, always sitting patiently in the passenger area. I started asking around the funeral home about previous transport experiences. Had other drivers noticed anything unusual during evening runs? Any recurring passenger sightings? Unexplained mirror reflections? Technical problems with the vehicle's interior? Most of my colleagues looked at me like I was losing my mind. But Margaret, our senior transport coordinator who'd been with Harborview for 20 years, pulled me aside after one of these conversations. "Joyce, you're seeing the lady in blue, aren't you? You know about her? I drove transports for 12 years before moving to coordination. She showed up in my mirrors every Thursday evening, same as you're describing. Always looked like she was waiting for something, or maybe riding along to make sure everything went smoothly. Did you ever figure out who she was?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Dorothy Kellerman. Used to volunteer here in the 1980s and early 90s. She'd ride along with evening transports, provide comfort to families, help with logistics. Lovely woman. Very dedicated to the work. What happened to her? Died in 1994. Cancer. But even after she passed, drivers would occasionally see her in their mirrors during Thursday evening runs. Thursday was always her volunteer night. I researched Dorothy Kellerman in our records and found confirmation of Margaret's story. Volunteer coordinator from 1982 to 1994. Specialized in family support during difficult transports. Multiple commendations from grateful families. Recognition from the funeral home board for exceptional service. Her obituary mentioned that she'd requested to be buried in the blue dress she always wore while volunteering, the one with white buttons that she considered her work uniform. The more I learned about Dorothy, the more her presence made sense. She'd spent 12 years riding along with evening transports, providing comfort and support during some of the most emotional journeys families would ever take. Death hadn't ended her commitment to that work. It had just made her invisible to everyone except the drivers who needed to know they weren't alone. I stopped being frightened by the woman in the blue dress. Instead, I began to appreciate her presence. Evening transports can be lonely, especially when you're carrying someone who died unexpectedly or tragically. Having Dorothy in the mirror felt like having an experienced colleague along for the ride, someone who understood the weight of the work and the importance of treating every transport with dignity. Sometimes, during particularly difficult transports, I'd talk to her, not expecting an answer, just sharing observations about the weather, comments about the families we were serving, reflections on the responsibility we carried. She never responded, but I sensed she was listening. Other drivers have confirmed similar experiences. Dorothy appears in mirrors during Thursday evening transports, still wearing her blue dress, still providing silent support for the work she dedicated her life to. She's become part of the routine, an unofficial member of the transport team who ensures that no driver has to handle the most challenging runs alone. The funeral home doesn't officially acknowledge these sightings, but they don't discourage drivers from talking about them either. Dorothy Kellerman was beloved by staff and families alike. If her spirit continues to ride along with evening transports, providing comfort through her presence, that seems fitting rather than frightening. I still see her every Thursday evening, reflected in my side mirror, during the journey to whatever cemetery needs our services. She's a reminder that some people are so committed to helping others that death can't stop them from showing up for work. The woman in the blue dress is my guardian angel, my invisible colleague, my assurance that the most important work, caring for people during their transition from life to death, attracts helpers who transcend the normal boundaries of existence. Every Thursday, I adjust my mirrors carefully and wait for Dorothy to take her place in the passenger compartment, ready for another evening of service to families who need our care. Music has power over memory, and sometimes the dead remember songs that only the living should know. I'm David Park, and I've been driving for Graceland Funeral Services for 10 years. It's quiet work most of the time, respectful silence during transport, soft instrumental music if families request it, minimal conversation unless someone needs comfort or information. You learn to appreciate the peaceful moments, the gentle rhythm of a hearse moving carefully through familiar streets toward its final destination. I never expected to hear my grandmother's lullaby coming from the cargo area during a routine transport sung by someone who had died 3 days earlier. It happened on a Wednesday morning in November. Mrs. Rose Patterson, 92 years old, passed away peacefully at Sunset Manor Nursing Home. Natural causes, surrounded by family. The kind of death that everyone hopes for when they reach advanced age. Her daughter, Linda, had arranged a simple service at St. Mary's Cemetery, with viewing at our funeral home for close friends and relatives. Mrs. Patterson was a small woman, maybe 90 pounds, carried in our standard casket for elderly clients. Nothing unusual about the transport 15-minute drive through residential neighborhoods, light traffic, clear weather. I loaded her carefully and began the familiar route to St. Mary's. About 5 minutes into the journey, I heard humming. It was soft, melodic, barely audible over the engine noise. At first I thought it might be coming from outside, someone working in their yard, maybe a radio playing in a passing car. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the sound was coming from inside the hearse, from the cargo area behind me. The melody was hauntingly familiar. A lullaby my grandmother used to sing when I was very young, something she'd learned from her own mother in Korea. Simple tune, soothing rhythm, words in a language I'd never fully understood, but that had always made me feel safe and loved. I hadn't heard that lullaby in 20 years, not since my grandmother's death when I was 16. It wasn't something she'd taught to other family members, wasn't recorded anywhere. As far as I knew, it had died with her. But someone in my hearse was humming it perfectly, note for note, with the same gentle inflection my grandmother had used. I pulled over and checked the cargo area. Mrs. Patterson's casket was sealed and secure, exactly as it should be. No mechanical noises, no audio equipment, no logical source for the humming. But when I got back in the driver's seat and continued toward the cemetery, the melody resumed. It wasn't coming from the casket itself, exactly. The sound seemed to fill the entire cargo space, as if someone was sitting in the passenger area, humming contentedly while watching the scenery pass by. Soft enough to be comforting, clear enough to be unmistakable. I found myself humming along, remembering words I thought I'd forgotten, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the November weather. For 10 minutes, driving through suburban streets with Mrs. Patterson, I was 7 years old again, falling asleep in my grandmother's arms while she sang away my childhood fears. The humming stopped when we reached St. Mary's Cemetery, fading gently as I parked near the receiving area. Mrs. Patterson's graveside service proceeded normally, and I didn't mention the lullaby to anyone. What would I say? That a dead woman had been humming my grandmother's song? But after the service, Linda Patterson approached me with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Park, I hope this doesn't sound strange, but did you notice anything unusual during the drive here?" I studied her face carefully. What kind of unusual? She was humming during transport, wasn't she? I could feel it, somehow, like she was singing to someone. "You think your mother was humming?" Linda smiled, tears forming in her eyes. Mother raised 6 children and 14 grandchildren. She hummed constantly while cooking, while cleaning, while rocking babies to sleep. It was her way of showing love, of making everything feel safe and peaceful. Did she know any Korean lullabies? Korean? No, I don't think so. Why? I hesitated, then decided to tell her the truth. I heard humming during the transport, a lullaby my grandmother used to sing when I was little. I hadn't heard it in 20 years. Linda's expression brightened. That sounds exactly like something Mother would do. She had this gift for knowing what people needed to hear, what would comfort them. She used to say that lullabies were a universal language, that every culture had songs to chase away fear and loneliness. Over the following months, the humming became a regular occurrence during certain transports. Not every journey, but specific ones, usually involving elderly clients who had been caregivers themselves, people who had spent their lives comforting others through music, stories, or gentle presence. The songs were always different, always personal to my experience or memories. Sometimes it was hymns my mother had sung in church when I was young. Other times, it was folk songs I'd learned in school, or melodies from my childhood that I'd assumed were lost forever. But they were never random. Every hummed tune connected to something meaningful in my life, some moment of comfort or safety that the music had provided. As if the deceased passengers were somehow accessing my memories and returning those gifts of peace during their final journey. Mrs. Eleanor Kim hummed Amazing Grace during her transport, the same version my father had sung at my graduation. Mr. James Wong's journey was accompanied by a Korean folk song my grandfather had hummed while teaching me to fish. Mrs. Dorothy Chen filled the cargo area with a lullaby I remembered from summer visits to my aunt's house. I started keeping a journal of these musical transports, noting which songs I heard and what memories they triggered. The pattern was unmistakable. The deceased were somehow sharing melodies that had shaped my life, returning comfort I'd received from others during my own moments of need. The most profound experience came during Mrs. Sarah Nakamura's transport in February. She had been a music teacher for 40 years, someone who had taught thousands of children to find joy and expression through song. During her journey to Forest Lawn Cemetery, I heard not one melody, but an entire chorus, children's voices, blending in harmony, singing songs I'd learned in elementary school. But underneath the chorus, barely audible, was my grandmother's lullaby again. The same Korean melody that had started this whole experience, now woven into a symphony of childhood memories and musical comfort. After Mrs. Nakamura's service, her son Michael approached me. "My mother always said that music was the closest thing we have to magic," he told me. "She believed that songs could travel through time and space, connecting people across impossible distances." "Did she teach Korean songs?" She taught everything: classical pieces, folk songs from dozens of cultures, lullabies from around the world. She said that every musical tradition contained wisdom about how to comfort the human heart. I realized then that the humming wasn't random spiritual activity, it was a form of musical ministry, a way for people who had dedicated their lives to providing comfort through song to continue that work, even after death. They were using melodies from my own experience to remind me that music creates bonds that transcend normal boundaries of time, culture, and existence. The humming continues during certain transports. I've learned to appreciate these musical journeys, to listen carefully for the messages embedded in familiar melodies. Sometimes the songs remind me of people I've loved. Sometimes they recall moments of peace during difficult periods. Sometimes they simply provide companionship during the solitary work of transport. Other drivers have reported similar experiences. Melodies that shouldn't be possible, songs that connect to personal memories, musical comfort during the most emotionally challenging transports. We don't discuss it officially, but there's an understanding among those who've experienced it. Some passengers continue to provide care through the universal language of song. I've started humming back sometimes, joining my voice to theirs during the journey to whatever cemetery awaits. It feels like a conversation, a musical exchange between the living and the dead, a reminder that comfort can flow in both directions, across the boundary between life and death. My grandmother's lullaby still appears occasionally, usually during transports of elderly women who remind me of her wisdom and gentleness. When I hear it, I remember being small and scared, and finding safety in her arms while she sang away the darkness. Now I understand that she's still singing, still providing comfort through the voices of others who shared her gift for healing through music. The melody travels from passenger to passenger, carried by people who understood that some forms of love are too powerful to be stopped by death. Every transport has the potential to become a concert, a private performance of songs that have shaped my life and continue to provide comfort during the sacred work of helping people reach their final rest. The cargo area becomes a concert hall. The hearse becomes a vehicle for musical memory, and the journey becomes an opportunity to remember that we are never truly alone, as long as someone, somewhere, is still humming our song. A hearse should never become a prison, but sometimes the dead have unfinished business with the journey itself. I'm Amanda Foster, and I've been driving for Meridian Funeral Services for 9 years. Safety is paramount in this work. Multiple exit strategies, reliable door mechanisms, emergency protocols for any situation that might arise during transport. Our vehicles are maintained to the highest standards, with door locks that respond immediately to manual controls and automatic safety releases that prevent anyone from being trapped inside. I test every door before every transport, verify that all locks and latches function properly, ensure that I can exit the vehicle quickly if necessary. It's basic safety protocol that every driver follows religiously. That's why what started happening during accident victim transports was so unsettling. The doors would lock themselves, trapping me inside the hearse until we reached the burial site, as if someone was determined to ensure I completed the journey no matter what. It began with Trevor Mills, 23 years old, killed in a motorcycle accident on Route 94. Single vehicle crash, no other parties involved. Died instantly, according to the police report. His family requested transport to Oakwood Cemetery for a Saturday morning service. Standard loading procedures, normal route planning, everything exactly as it should be. But 5 minutes into the transport, I heard the distinctive sound of door locks engaging. All 4 doors locked simultaneously. Driver's door, passenger door, both rear doors. The interior door handles moved freely, but the locks wouldn't disengage. I was effectively trapped inside the hearse with Trevor's casket, unable to exit until something released the mechanism. My first thought was electrical malfunction. Modern vehicles have complex locking systems controlled by computerized modules, and occasionally those systems can fail or receive conflicting signals. I tried the manual unlock button, the key fob, even the emergency release lever that should override any electronic lock. Nothing worked. The doors remained sealed as if they'd been welded shut. I wasn't in immediate danger. The hearse was running normally. Air conditioning was working, and I could still communicate via cell phone if necessary. But being unable to exit your vehicle is deeply unsettling, especially when you're carrying someone who died in a traffic accident. The locks remained engaged for the entire 20-minute journey to Oakwood Cemetery. I tested them at traffic lights, tried different combinations of controls, even considered calling for emergency assistance. But everything else about the vehicle functioned perfectly, and Trevor's burial was scheduled to proceed on time. The moment I parked at the cemetery receiving area, all 4 doors unlocked with a soft click. Sudden, simultaneous, as if someone had pressed a master release button. I tested the mechanisms immediately. Everything worked normally, responding to controls exactly as they should. Trevor's service proceeded without incident, and I didn't mention the door malfunction to anyone. Vehicle quirks happen, especially with the complex electronics in modern hearses. I scheduled the car for maintenance inspection the following Monday. The mechanic found nothing wrong. Door locks, electrical systems, computer modules, emergency releases, everything tested within normal parameters. No fault codes, no indication of malfunction, no explanation for what I'd experienced. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Maria Santos, 19 years old, killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver. Her transport to St. Joseph's Cemetery followed the same pattern: normal loading, normal departure, then immediate door lock engagement that lasted until we reached the burial site. This time, I was prepared with a stopwatch. The locks engaged at exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds into the journey. They remained locked for 17 minutes and 45 seconds, then released the moment I parked at the cemetery. I started keeping detailed logs of every transport, noting any unusual mechanical behavior, timing anomalies, or safety concerns. Over the following months, a clear pattern emerged. Door locks only engaged during transports of people who had died in vehicle accidents, car crashes, motorcycle accidents, pedestrian fatalities involving automobiles. The timing was consistent. Locks would engage within 5 minutes of departure and remain engaged until we reached the cemetery. Never longer than necessary, never shorter than the complete journey. As if someone was ensuring I stayed with the vehicle for the entire trip, preventing any possibility of abandoning the transport. Robert Chen, 41, rear-ended by a distracted driver. Doors locked for the duration of his transport to Pine Valley Cemetery. Jennifer Walsh, 28, killed when her car skidded off an icy road. Lock engagement from departure to arrival at Hillside Memorial. David Rodriguez, 35, struck by a hit-and-run driver while crossing the street. 23 minutes of locked doors during his journey to Forest Lawn. Each transport followed the same pattern, and each time I felt the same unsettling sense of being held responsible for completing the journey, regardless of my own preferences or safety concerns. But here's what I gradually realized. The lock engagement wasn't threatening, it was protective. During Michael Patterson's transport, 16 years old, killed in a single-car accident caused by texting while driving, I encountered road construction that forced a detour through an unfamiliar industrial area. Bad neighborhood, heavy traffic, multiple opportunities for delay or distraction. Normally, I might have pulled over to consult GPS, maybe gotten out to check road signs or ask for directions. But with the doors locked, I was committed to staying in the vehicle, staying focused on the transport, ensuring that Michael reached his burial site safely, despite the complications. The locks weren't trapping me. They were protecting the integrity of the journey, ensuring that nothing could interrupt the sacred responsibility of delivering someone to their final rest. I started to appreciate the forced commitment. Driving while locked in the hearse meant no stops for coffee, no detours for personal errands, no distractions from the primary mission. Just me, the deceased, and the shared journey to whatever cemetery awaited. During Sarah Kim's Transport 42, killed in a multi-vehicle pileup, I had a family emergency call that would normally have required immediate attention. But with the doors locked, I couldn't abandon Sarah's transport to deal with personal issues. The burial took precedence, as it should. The emergency turned out to be manageable by other family members, and Sarah's service proceeded exactly on schedule. The forced priorities taught me something important about the sacred nature of transport work. When you're carrying someone to their final rest, that responsibility supersedes almost everything else. Other drivers began reporting similar experiences. Door lock malfunctions during accident victim transports, always lasting exactly the duration of the journey, always releasing at the cemetery. Mechanics could never find problems with the vehicles, and the locks functioned normally during all other types of transport. We developed an unofficial understanding. When transporting vehicle accident victims, expect to be committed to the journey from start to finish. The doors will lock, you'll complete the transport without interruption, and you'll deliver your passengers safely to their destination. It feels appropriate. Somehow, people who died in vehicle accidents often, suddenly, without warning, without the chance to say goodbye or complete their final business, deserve drivers who are equally committed to completing their journey. The locked doors ensure that nothing interferes with that responsibility. I don't fight the lock engagement anymore. When I hear that familiar click during an accident victim transport, I settle in for a focused, uninterrupted journey. No stops, no detours, no distractions. Just the sacred work of ensuring that someone who lost control of their own vehicle gets delivered safely to their final destination. The doors unlock when the job is complete, never a moment before. It's a system that prioritizes the needs of the dead over the convenience of the living. And in this business, that seems exactly as it should be. Every time I transport someone who died in a vehicle accident, I'm reminded that some journeys are too important to allow for interruption. The locked doors ensure that these final trips receive the focused attention they deserve, completed by drivers who are as committed to reaching the destination as their passengers once were to arriving safely at their own. Distance is measured in more than miles when you're carrying someone who traveled far from home to serve their country. I'm Carl Singh, and I've been a transport driver for Liberty Funeral Home for 8 years. Precision matters in this work. Accurate mileage tracking for billing purposes, reliable route planning for scheduling, detailed logs for insurance and regulatory compliance. I keep meticulous records of every transport, starting odometer reading, ending reading, actual distance traveled versus GPS estimates. My odometer has never been wrong about the distance between 2 points until I started transporting veterans who had served overseas. It began with Sergeant First Class Robert Martinez, Army veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan before returning home to work as a high school counselor. He died at 71 from complications related to Agent Orange exposure, a delayed consequence of service that took decades to claim his life. The transport from Liberty Funeral Home to Veterans Memorial Cemetery was exactly 12.4 miles, according to every GPS system, mapping service, and route calculator I'd ever used. I'd driven that route hundreds of times, knew every turn and landmark, could estimate the travel time within 2 minutes. I noted my starting odometer reading, 43,218 miles. Standard procedure before every transport, recorded in my logbook for billing accuracy. The journey to Veterans Memorial proceeded normally. Clear weather, light traffic, no delays or detours. I delivered Sergeant Martinez to the cemetery receiving area exactly on schedule, parked in the designated spot, and completed my post-transport vehicle inspection. Ending odometer reading, 43,231 miles, 13 miles. For a 12.4-mile journey. I double-checked my calculations, verified my starting and ending readings, even measured the route again using GPS. Every source confirmed the same distance, 12.4 miles. But my odometer insisted I'd traveled 13 miles. I assumed it was a mechanical error. Odometers can drift slightly over time, especially in older vehicles. A 6/10 of a mile discrepancy wasn't unprecedented, though it was unusual for such a precisely maintained vehicle. But the same thing happened 2 weeks later. Staff Sergeant Linda Washington, Marines, served 2 tours in Iraq before transitioning to civilian life as a paramedic. She died at 59 from injuries sustained in an ambulance accident, serving others until the end, just as she had during her military career. Same route to Veterans Memorial Cemetery, same 12.4-mile distance. But my odometer gained an extra mile during transport, showing 13 miles traveled for a journey that should have been shorter. I began paying closer attention to these discrepancies, noting odometer readings for every transport and comparing them to verified distances. The pattern became clear. Veterans who had served overseas consistently generated extra mileage during their final journey to burial. The additional distance varied depending on their service record. Veterans with single deployments added about 6/10 of a mile. Multiple deployment veterans generated a full extra mile. Those who had served in multiple conflicts or specialized units sometimes produced odometer readings that were 2 or even 3 miles higher than the actual distance traveled. Petty Officer James Kim, Navy, served on a destroyer in the Persian Gulf and later on submarine patrols in the Pacific. His transport to Veterans Memorial showed 15 miles on my odometer for the standard 12.4-mile route. Master Sergeant Dorothy Chen, Air Force, served as a flight engineer on cargo planes that delivered supplies to forward operating bases throughout the Middle East. Her final journey registered 14.7 miles. Captain Michael Torres, Army Special Forces, multiple classified deployments across 3 decades of service. His transport generated an odometer reading of 18 miles, 5.6 miles more than the actual distance to the cemetery. I started researching the service records of veterans I transported, comparing their overseas deployments to the extra mileage their final journeys produced. The correlation was unmistakable. The more miles they had traveled in service to their country, the more additional distance appeared on my odometer during their transport to burial. It was as if their final journey was somehow incorporating all the distances they had covered while deployed, adding the miles they had traveled far from home to serve in dangerous, unfamiliar places. Their last ride was taking them not just to the cemetery, but through a spiritual geography that included every mile they had walked, driven, or flown in uniform. The most profound example was Colonel Sarah Nakamura, Army Corps of Engineers, who had spent 30 years designing and building infrastructure in combat zones. Her transport to Veterans Memorial showed 22 miles on my odometer, nearly 10 miles more than the physical distance. After her burial, I spoke with her son, who was also active duty military. Colonel Nakamura built roads, bridges, and airfields in places most people couldn't find on a map, he told me. She used to say that every mile of infrastructure she created brought troops closer to home, made their journeys safer. How many countries did she serve in? 12 different deployments over 3 decades. Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Horn of Africa, dozens of training missions in allied countries. She probably traveled more miles in uniform than most people drive in their entire civilian lives. That evening, I calculated the additional mileage from Colonel Nakamura's transport and researched the approximate distances she might have covered during her military career. The extra miles on my odometer corresponded almost exactly to what someone would accumulate during 30 years of overseas deployments. I began to understand that the additional mileage wasn't a mechanical error, it was a form of honor, a recognition of the distances these veterans had traveled in service to others. Their final journey was incorporating all the miles they had covered while protecting and serving people they would never meet, in places they would never see again. The extra miles felt like a tribute, a way of acknowledging that some people travel far beyond the boundaries of normal civilian life, sacrificing comfort and safety to serve others in dangerous, remote locations. I stopped reporting the odometer discrepancies as mechanical problems. Instead, I started including them in my transport logs as service miles, additional distance, that reflected the veteran's commitment to traveling wherever duty required, regardless of personal cost or inconvenience. Other drivers began noticing similar patterns when transporting veterans: extra mileage that corresponded to overseas service, odometer readings that honored the distances covered during military careers, final journeys that somehow incorporated all the miles traveled in uniform. The funeral home never questioned these discrepancies officially, but there was an understanding among drivers who worked with veteran families. Some transports cover more ground than the physical distance suggests, honoring journeys that began long before the final ride to the cemetery. Every time I transport a veteran to their final rest, I note the extra mileage with respect and gratitude. Those additional miles represent sacrifice, service, and commitment to traveling wherever others needed protection, regardless of the personal cost. The odometer tells the full story of their travels, not just the final 12.4 miles to Veterans Memorial Cemetery, but every mile they covered while serving others, every journey they made to keep the rest of us safe. Some people travel farther than maps can measure, and their final journey should reflect the full distance of their service. The extra miles on my odometer are a small tribute to veterans who never counted the cost of going wherever their country needed them to go. The silence in a hearse can be profound, but sometimes it's broken by conversations between people who should no longer be able to speak. I'm Linda Walsh, and I've been a hearse operator for Sunset Memorial Services for 12 years. It's contemplative work that requires comfort with silence, long stretches of quiet during transport, respectful stillness during loading and unloading, peaceful moments that allow families to process their grief without intrusion. I've learned to appreciate the quiet, to find peace in the gentle rhythm of a hearse moving through familiar streets. The deceased deserve tranquil final journeys, and I provide that through careful driving and respectful silence. But occasionally, the silence is broken by voices from the passenger area, conversations between people who shouldn't be able to talk, discussing memories that span generations and losses that connect across decades. It started during Mr. Harold Patterson's transport in September. He was 87, a retired postal worker who had raised 5 children after his wife died young. His grandson Tommy had been killed in Vietnam 30 years earlier, something Mr. Patterson never fully recovered from. The family mentioned that he'd never stopped talking to Tommy, never stopped missing the fishing trips and baseball games they'd shared. I loaded Mr. Patterson for transport to Greenwood Cemetery on a quiet Thursday morning. Standard procedure, normal route, everything proceeding exactly as expected. But about 10 minutes into the journey, I began hearing voices from the passenger area. 2 distinct speakers, an elderly man and a young person, maybe a teenager or someone in their early 20s. The conversation was muffled, like people talking quietly in a room with thick walls, but certain words were clear enough to understand. Remember that trout you caught at Miller's Pond? You taught me to bait the hook properly. Never missed one of your games after that. Proud of you, Grandpa. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see family members who had somehow climbed into the passenger area without my noticing. But the space was empty, except for Mr. Patterson's casket, secured and draped exactly as it should be. The conversation continued for the remainder of the transport. 2 voices sharing memories of fishing trips, baseball games, family gatherings. Sometimes, the elderly voice would chuckle at something the younger voice said. Sometimes, there would be long pauses, comfortable silences between people who understood each other completely. When we reached Greenwood Cemetery, the voices faded gradually, like a radio being slowly turned down, until only silence remained. Mr. Patterson's graveside service was well attended, with several family members speaking about his devotion to his deceased grandson. His daughter mentioned that her father had maintained Tommy's bedroom exactly as it was the day he left for Vietnam, and that he'd continued buying baseball tickets for both of them every season, leaving Tommy's seat empty as a tribute. Dad never stopped talking to Tommy, she said during the eulogy. He'd tell him about the grandchildren Tommy never got to meet, describe games Tommy couldn't attend, share all the family news that accumulated over 30 years. I think Dad was looking forward to finally having Tommy's full attention again. Over the following months, I began hearing similar conversations during certain transports, always involving elderly clients who had lost children or grandchildren prematurely, always featuring two distinct voices discussing shared memories and deep affection. Mrs. Dorothy Kim, who lost her 8-year-old son in a car accident 40 years earlier, was accompanied by a child's voice, singing songs they used to share at bedtime. Mr. James Rodriguez, whose teenage daughter had died from leukemia, was joined by a young woman's voice, discussing the college plans she'd never been able to pursue. Mrs. Eleanor Chen, who had outlived 3 of her 6 children, traveled with multiple voices representing different generations of family members who had died before their time. The conversations weren't sad or mournful. They were peaceful, joyful, filled with the kind of comfortable intimacy that comes from deep love and long-awaited reunion. They sounded like people who had been separated by circumstances beyond their control and were finally able to catch up on everything they'd missed. The most touching conversation occurred during Mr. William Torres's transport. He was 91, a World War II veteran whose 19-year-old son had been killed in Vietnam. For 50 years, Mr. Torres had carried guilt about surviving a war that his son hadn't, about coming home safely while his boy died on a distant battlefield. During the transport, I heard 2 male voices, one elderly, one young, having an extended conversation about military service, about sacrifice, about the different ways people serve their country and family. You did your duty, Dad. You came home to take care of the family. I should have been me over there. No, you raised good kids, lived a good life. That was your mission. Missed you every day. I know, but I've been watching. I've been proud. The conversation lasted for 25 minutes, covering decades of unspoken thoughts, unexpressed emotions, and unresolved grief. By the time we reached the cemetery, both voices sounded peaceful, as if important business had finally been concluded. After Mr. Torres's burial, his surviving son approached me. "Did you hear them talking during the ride?" he asked quietly. "I heard voices," I said carefully. "A conversation between what sounded like a father and son." He nodded, unsurprised. Dad talked to Billy every day for 50 years. At the dinner table, during baseball games, whenever he was working in the garage. Mom used to say it was like Billy had never really left, just moved to a room where only Dad could hear him. I realized that these passenger area conversations weren't supernatural anomalies. They were continuations of relationships that death had interrupted but not ended. People who had spent decades talking to children and grandchildren they'd lost were finally able to hear responses, to engage in the two-way conversations they'd been practicing for years. The hearse became a meeting place, a neutral space where the living and the dead could share their final journey together, catching up on everything that had accumulated during their separation. I've learned to appreciate these conversations, to respect the privacy of reunions that have been decades in the making. I drive carefully, maintain steady speed, and avoid sudden movements that might interrupt discussions between people who have been waiting years to talk to each other again. The voices always fade as we approach the cemetery, conversations concluding naturally, as if both parties understand that the formal goodbye is approaching. But they sound satisfied, peaceful, like people who have finally been able to say everything they'd been saving up. Silence returns to the hearse after these transports, but it's a different kind of quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of completed communication, resolved emotions, and relationships that have been given the chance to reach proper closure. The passenger area becomes sacred space during these journeys, hosting reunions between people who loved each other enough to maintain one-sided conversations for decades, trusting that someday, somehow, their voices would be heard and answered by the people they'd never stopped missing. Fuel gauges measure more than gasoline when you're returning from burying someone who spent their life keeping others moving. I'm Robert Hayes, and I've been driving for Mountain View Funeral Services for 15 years. Fuel management is critical in this work, calculating consumption for round trips, ensuring adequate range for remote cemetery locations, maintaining detailed logs for operational efficiency. I monitor fuel levels obsessively, track mileage per gallon, and never begin a transport without confirming I have sufficient fuel for the complete journey. My fuel gauge has always been accurate, reliable, predictable. Until I started transporting people who had worked in automotive or transportation industries and began returning from their burials with more fuel than I'd started with. It began with Eddie Martinez, 68, who had operated a gas station for 42 years before retiring. He'd built his business on reliability, always open, always stocked, always ready to help stranded motorists get back on the road. His funeral was scheduled for Thursday morning at Sunset Memorial, about a 30-minute drive through mountain roads. I started the transport with 3/4 of a tank, normal for the expected distance and return trip. The fuel gauge showed exactly where it should, given recent consumption patterns and the vehicle's documented efficiency. Eddie's graveside service was simple but well attended. Former customers, fellow business owners, family members who appreciated his decades of service to the community. Several people mentioned how Eddie had never refused to help someone who ran out of gas, regardless of the hour or weather conditions. The return trip to Mountain View Funeral Services followed the same route, same driving conditions, same vehicle performance. But when I parked at the funeral home and shut off the engine, my fuel gauge showed a completely full tank. Not just more fuel than I'd started with a completely full tank, as if I'd stopped for gas during the return trip. The needle pointed to the maximum level, and the digital display showed 100% fuel capacity. I assumed it was a gauge malfunction. Electronic fuel level sensors occasionally fail, providing false readings or getting stuck at certain positions. I made a note to have the vehicle inspected and continued with my regular duties. But the same thing happened 2 weeks later. Margaret Thompson, 73, who had been a city bus driver for 35 years before retiring. She'd transported thousands of people safely to their destinations, working every shift, covering every route, never missing work unless absolutely necessary. Her transport to Pine Valley Cemetery proceeded normally, but the return trip again resulted in a mysteriously full fuel tank. I began documenting these fuel anomalies, noting the connection to transportation industry professionals. Over the following months, the pattern became unmistakable. People who had spent their careers keeping vehicles running, helping others travel safely, or maintaining transportation infrastructure somehow provided fuel for their own final journey. Frank Rodriguez, automotive mechanic, 47 years of keeping cars operational. Return trip, full tank. Linda Kim, truck driver, 3 decades of long-haul transportation. Return trip, full tank. James Patterson, retired airline pilot, thousands of hours safely transporting passengers. Return trip, full tank. Each time, the fuel gauge would jump from whatever level I'd started with to maximum capacity during the return trip from burial. Not gradually, not as a result of filling up somewhere instantaneously, as if the fuel tank had been mysteriously refilled while parked at the cemetery. I tested various theories: hidden fuel sources at cemetery locations, gauge calibration errors, computer system glitches. None explained the consistent pattern of fuel level increases during returns from burying transportation professionals. The most dramatic example occurred during Harold Chen's transport. He'd been a railroad engineer for 4 decades, responsible for massive freight trains that carried goods across thousands of miles. His funeral was at a remote mountain cemetery, requiring a 40-mile round trip that should have consumed nearly half a tank of fuel. I started with exactly 1/4 tank remaining, cutting it close, but adequate for the journey. During the return trip, not only did my fuel gauge show full, but the digital display indicated I had traveled 0 miles since the last fill-up, despite having driven 80 miles that day. After Harold's burial, his son mentioned something that helped me understand what was happening. Dad always said that the most important part of any journey was making sure everyone got home safely. He told me he'd stay at the rail yard until every train was accounted for. Every engineer had checked in. Every piece of equipment was properly maintained. He couldn't stand the thought of someone getting stranded because of mechanical failure. The fuel anomalies weren't malfunctions. They were gifts from people who had spent their lives ensuring that vehicles could complete their journeys safely. Even in death, they were providing the resources necessary to get their drivers home. I started thinking of these mysterious fuel increases as professional courtesy from one transportation worker to another. People who understood the importance of reliable fuel supply, who had spent their careers preventing others from getting stranded, were making sure I had adequate fuel to complete their final transport safely. Dorothy Walsh, who had worked at the Department of Motor Vehicles for 30 years, helped people get licenses and registrations to travel legally. Return trip, full tank. Michael Torres, owner of a towing service, spent 40 years rescuing stranded motorists. Return trip, full tank. Sarah Nakamura, traffic engineer, designed road systems that helped millions of people travel efficiently. Return trip, full tank. Each transport felt like receiving a blessing from someone who understood the sacred responsibility of helping others complete their journeys safely. The fuel gauge increases became a source of comfort rather than confusion. Driving back from remote cemetery locations, I knew that someone who had dedicated their life to transportation was ensuring I wouldn't run out of fuel, wouldn't get stranded, wouldn't fail to complete the sacred duty of returning safely from their burial. Other drivers began reporting similar experiences. Mysterious fuel level increases during returns from burying automotive workers, transportation professionals, anyone whose career had involved keeping vehicles and people moving safely from one place to another. We developed an informal understanding. When transporting someone from the transportation industry, expect the return trip to be provided for. They're still looking after drivers, still ensuring that vehicles have adequate fuel to complete their journeys safely. I stopped questioning the fuel anomalies and started appreciating them as final acts of service from people who never stopped caring about transportation safety. My gauge might show impossible readings, but the fuel is real, the range is increased, and the return trip is always completed without concern for running out of gas. Every time I transport someone who spent their career keeping others moving, I'm reminded that some forms of service transcend death. They're still providing fuel, still ensuring safe journeys, still taking care of drivers who carry precious cargo to its final destination. The return trip becomes a testament to their lifelong commitment to helping others reach home safely. They provide the fuel necessary to complete their final transport, ensuring that their driver doesn't get stranded while returning from the sacred duty of laying them to rest. Some gifts come from people who understand exactly what resources are needed to complete important journeys. The fuel they provide isn't just gasoline, it's a final expression of care for the drivers who serve others, ensuring that everyone gets home safely, just as they did throughout their working lives. The fuel gauge may show impossible readings, but the message is clear. Some people never stop taking care of transportation, never stop ensuring that drivers have what they need to complete their routes successfully. Every return trip becomes a reminder that service to others creates bonds that extend beyond death, and that people who spent their lives keeping others moving will find ways to provide fuel for one final journey home. Paperwork in the funeral business is sacred. Every detail matters. Every document tells a story. Every form connects someone to their final rest. But sometimes the paperwork writes itself, updating to honor appointments that were made decades ago. I'm Gene Murphy, and I've been a transport specialist for Riverside Memorial Services for 14 years. Documentation accuracy is fundamental to my work. Transport schedules, burial permits, family contact information, cemetery plot assignments. I maintain meticulous records because families depend on precise coordination during the most difficult days of their lives. Every transport begins with detailed paperwork verification. I check names, dates, times, cemetery locations, and special family requests. These documents guide every aspect of the service, ensuring that someone's final journey proceeds exactly according to their wishes and their family's needs. My paperwork has always remained exactly as I prepare it, unchanged from initial creation through final filing. Until I started transporting people whose documents mysteriously updated themselves during transport, changing details to match arrangements that had been made years or even decades earlier. It began with Mrs. Catherine Williams, 89 years old, who died peacefully at Maple Grove Nursing Home. Her daughter had arranged a simple burial at Sunset Memorial Cemetery, Plot Section C, Lot Number 23. Standard documentation, normal scheduling, everything prepared according to current family instructions. But during the 20-minute transport to Sunset Memorial, my paperwork changed. I'd glanced at the transport forms before departure destination clearly listed as Sunset Memorial Cemetery, Section C, Lot 23. But when I checked the documentation upon arrival, it read Greenwood Cemetery, Section A, Lot 7. Not just the cemetery name, but the complete burial information. Different location, different plot assignment, different sections and numbering systems. As if someone had rewritten the entire transport order while I was driving. My first thought was that I'd grabbed the wrong paperwork, mixed up transport orders for different families. But when I called our dispatch coordinator, she confirmed that Mrs. Williams was indeed scheduled for Greenwood Cemetery, Section A, Lot 7. That's what the family requested, Gene. Greenwood Cemetery, where her husband is buried, has been on the schedule all week. But I distinctly remembered preparing paperwork for Sunset Memorial. I double-checked the cemetery location, verified the plot assignment, confirmed the route timing. My memory was clear, but my documentation told a different story. I drove to Greenwood Cemetery. According to the updated paperwork, Mrs. Williams' graveside service proceeded exactly as the forms indicated, with family members who appreciated the seamless coordination and perfect timing. After the burial, Mrs. Williams' daughter mentioned something that helped explain the document changes. Mother always said she wanted to be buried next to Dad at Greenwood, she told me. But when we made the arrangements last week, I was so overwhelmed with grief that I accidentally told you Sunset Memorial, that's where my mother-in-law is buried. I realized the mistake later, but when I called to correct it, your coordinator said the paperwork already showed Greenwood Cemetery. The documentation had somehow corrected itself, updating to reflect Mrs. Williams' actual wishes rather than her daughter's mistaken instructions. Over the following months, similar paperwork changes began occurring regularly. Transport documents would mysteriously update during transport, always correcting errors or incorporating important details that families had forgotten to mention during initial arrangements. Mr. Harold Kim's paperwork changed from a standard burial service to include military honors, reflecting his previously undisclosed service in the Korean War. Mrs. Dorothy Rodriguez's documentation updated to specify that her casket should be positioned facing east, honoring cultural traditions that her family had neglected to mention. Mr. James Patterson's forms mysteriously included instructions for a specific hymn to be played during graveside service, a song his wife later confirmed was their wedding song, something they'd discussed but forgotten to arrange officially. Each change improved the service, honored the deceased person's actual wishes, or corrected oversights that would have resulted in burial arrangements that didn't properly reflect someone's life, values, or cultural background. The most dramatic example occurred during Mrs. Eleanor Chen's transport. Her paperwork initially indicated burial at Pine Valley Cemetery, plot section F. But during transport, the documentation completely rewrote itself to show burial at Veterans Memorial Cemetery, with full military honors for service as a World War II nurse. Mrs. Chen's family had never mentioned military service, and Veterans Memorial wasn't part of our original arrangements. But when I called our coordinator, she confirmed that Mrs. Chen was indeed scheduled for Veterans Memorial, with military honors arranged through the Department of Veterans Affairs. The family brought in her discharge papers yesterday, the coordinator explained. Turns out she served as a battlefield nurse in the Pacific Theater, Purple Heart recipient. They found her medals in her jewelry box after the funeral arrangements were already made. The paperwork had updated itself to honor service that had been temporarily forgotten during the initial grief and confusion of making burial arrangements. I began to understand that these document changes weren't clerical errors, they were corrections, updates that ensured someone's final arrangements properly reflected their life, service, and personal wishes. The paperwork was self-editing to honor commitments and preferences that transcended normal documentation processes. Mrs. Sarah Walsh's transport documents updated to include her maiden name on the burial marker, reflecting her request to be remembered by the name she'd carried as a young teacher. Mr. Michael Torres's paperwork mysteriously included instructions for burial in his military dress uniform, honoring service pride that his family had initially overlooked. Mrs. Linda Nakamura's documentation changed to specify burial in the Japanese section of the cemetery, respecting cultural connections that her children hadn't fully understood. Each change felt like receiving guidance from someone who knew exactly how their final arrangements should proceed, regardless of what their overwhelmed families had initially requested. I stopped questioning the document changes and started trusting them as superior sources of information about what the deceased actually wanted. The self-updating paperwork invariably led to services that felt more complete, more respectful, more aligned with someone's true life story. Other transport specialists began reporting similar experiences. Documentation that corrected itself during transport, paperwork that included details families had forgotten, forms that updated to honor wishes that hadn't been officially communicated. We developed an informal protocol. When paperwork changes during transport, follow the updated instructions. The new information invariably reflects someone's actual preferences more accurately than the original arrangements. The document changes became a source of comfort rather than confusion. Knowing that someone's paperwork might self-correct during transport meant that their final service would proceed according to their true wishes, regardless of what their grieving families had initially arranged. Every transport becomes an opportunity for someone to make final edits to their own arrangements, ensuring that their burial honors their life, service, and personal values exactly as they intended. The paperwork writes itself when necessary, guided by wisdom that transcends normal administrative processes. The documents become living records that adapt to honor the dead more completely than the living sometimes remember to arrange. Some people remain involved in their own funeral planning even after death, making corrections and additions that ensure their final service tells their complete story with accuracy, dignity, and respect for everything they accomplished during their time among the living. Some passengers book their own transportation, even when they're not officially scheduled for pickup. I'm Thomas Gray, and I've been a hearse driver for Eternal Peace Funeral Services for 16 years. Record keeping is essential in this work. Transport logs, client databases, cemetery coordination, billing documentation. Every transport is scheduled, documented, and tracked through multiple systems to ensure families receive exactly the services they've arranged and paid for. I know my monthly schedule by heart, can recite every transport, every cemetery destination, every family I'm scheduled to serve. My routes are planned weeks in advance, confirmed days before departure, and verified immediately before each journey. That's why my final transport of each month troubles me so much. I carry someone I've never met to cemeteries that aren't on my route list, complete services that have no documentation, and file paperwork that disappears from our records by the following morning. It always happens on the last day of the month, regardless of what day of the week that falls on. My final scheduled transport completes normally. I return to eternal peace. And then I receive one additional assignment that doesn't exist in any official system. The first time it happened was March 31st of last year. I'd completed Mrs. Dorothy Hanson's burial at Pine Valley Cemetery and was preparing to end my workday when dispatch called with an additional transport. Thomas, we need you to pick up Mr. William Morrison from the Hanson Funeral Home for burial at Restwood Cemetery. Family's waiting. I didn't recognize the client name, and Restwood Cemetery wasn't on my list of service locations. But dispatch sounded urgent, and schedule changes weren't uncommon when families needed last-minute arrangements. I drove to Hanson Funeral Home, a facility I'd never heard of, located in an older part of town I rarely visited. The building was modest but well-maintained, with a sign indicating they'd been serving families since 1943. Mr. Morrison was ready for transport, prepared according to normal protocols. The funeral director, an elderly man named Peterson, provided standard documentation and helped load the casket. Professional service. No unusual requests. Everything proceeding exactly as expected. Mr. Morrison was 97, Peterson told me. Lived a full life, ready to join his wife Margaret. She's been waiting for him at Restwood for 12 years. Restwood Cemetery turned out to be a small, well-maintained facility about 20 minutes from Hanson Funeral Home. Older graves, mature trees, peaceful setting that felt appropriate for someone who'd lived nearly a century. Mr. Morrison's graveside service was simple but dignified. About a dozen family members attended, elderly people who spoke about his kindness, his work as a carpenter, his devotion to Margaret during her final illness. I completed the transport, filed my paperwork, and updated my logs as usual. Standard procedures, normal documentation, everything processed according to company protocols. But the next morning, when I reviewed my monthly reports, there was no record of Mr. Morrison's transport, no client file, no billing information, no documentation in our computer system. According to official records, I'd completed my final transport with Mrs. Hanson and ended the month with no additional assignments. I assumed it was a database error, maybe a system glitch that had failed to properly record the additional transport. But when I called Hanson Funeral Home to verify billing information, the number was disconnected. I drove back to the location where I'd picked up Mr. Morrison. The building was still there, but it was empty, clearly vacant for months or possibly years. No funeral home operations, no Mr. Peterson. No indication that anyone had conducted business there recently. The same pattern repeated at the end of April. Final scheduled transport completed normally, then an additional assignment for someone I'd never heard of, pickup from a funeral home that turned out to be closed or non-existent, burial at a cemetery I'd never visited. Service proceeds normally, paperwork gets filed, but all records disappear by the following morning. May brought Mrs. Eleanor Kim, pickup from Mitchell Funeral Services, burial at Sunset Hills Cemetery. June was Mr. James Rodriguez, pickup from Family Memorial Home, burial at Riverside Gardens. July brought Mrs. Sarah Patterson, pickup from Community Funeral Services, burial at Valley View Cemetery. Each transport felt completely real during the experience. Normal loading procedures, standard documentation, routine burial services attended by families who appreciated professional service. But each transport vanished from official records within 24 hours, leaving no trace in any system or database. I began taking notes about these mysterious final transports, documenting details that might help explain what was happening. Names, dates, funeral home locations, cemetery destinations, family information, but even my personal notes would be mysteriously altered or erased by the following morning. The only consistent element was a single white rose that appeared on my dashboard after each mysterious transport. Fresh flower, recently cut, always placed in exactly the same position. The roses were real, physical objects that remained even when all other evidence of the transport disappeared. I started researching the people I transported during these final monthly assignments. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Kim, Mr. Rodriguez, Mrs. Patterson, all real people who had lived in the area, all deceased within the time frame of their transport, all buried in the cemeteries where I delivered them. But according to official records, they'd been buried years or even decades earlier by different funeral services. The transport dates on their death certificates didn't match the dates when I'd carried them to their graves. The most puzzling case was Mrs. Dorothy Chen, who I transported on August 31st to Green Meadows Cemetery. The service proceeded normally, with family members who spoke about her career as a school teacher and her love of gardening. But when I researched Mrs. Chen later, I discovered she'd been buried in 1987, 15 years before I'd started working in the funeral industry. According to official records, she'd been laid to rest by a funeral home that had closed in the early 1990s. I began to understand that these final monthly transports weren't serving current families. They were fulfilling appointments that had been made years earlier by people who had somehow arranged for future transportation, trusting that eventually someone would complete their journey to final rest. The mysterious transport assignments were honoring commitments that transcended normal scheduling systems, carrying people who had been waiting for proper burial services, ensuring that promises made decades earlier were finally fulfilled. Each final transport felt like completing unfinished business, helping people reach destinations that had been delayed by circumstances beyond their control. The families who attended these services were real, grateful for the professional care their loved ones received during journeys that had been decades in the making. I stopped questioning the monthly mysterious transports and started treating them as the most important assignments I received. People who had been waiting years or decades for proper burial deserved the same professional service as any current client. The final transport of each month became sacred duty, an opportunity to help someone complete a journey that had been interrupted by bureaucratic complications, financial difficulties, or family circumstances that had prevented proper burial arrangements. The white rose that appears after each transport has become my confirmation that I've successfully completed another appointment that was made long before I knew I'd be the driver. Someone, somewhere, had arranged for transportation that would eventually be provided by a driver they'd never meet, trusting that the funeral industry would honor commitments regardless of how much time had passed. Every month, I wait for that final assignment, ready to carry someone who has been patiently waiting for their journey to continue. The paperwork may disappear, the records may vanish, but the service is real. The burial is completed, and another promise made decades ago is finally fulfilled. Some passengers make reservations years in advance, trusting that eventually the right driver will receive their assignment and complete their journey to the destination they've been waiting to reach.